Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Down the Rabbit Hole, a podcast that goes beyond the paranormal, with your hosts, Sika Groves, Rachel Bender, and Ian Russell.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Down the Rabbit Hole, a podcast that goes beyond the paranormal. And I'm one of your hosts, Sika Groves. I'm just waiting for Rachel and Ian to call into the studio so that we can get today's show started. And today's show topic, we're going to be talking about Dracula, Frankenstein, and probably a few other gothic horror novels. But it should be a really interesting show. So if you're a fan of the horror genre, these are kind of the things that really kicked it off. So let me just pick up the call here and see who I've got on the line. Good afternoon.
Hello, Sika. How are you?
Hey, Rachel. I'm good. How are you?
Oh, I'm great, thank you. It's good to be here again. Even though the weather is rainy and miserable, I'm still in a good mood.
Oh, really? I hear it's sunny and breezy, and it's actually quite warm here today. So we had the rain we had the rain this morning, but it moved through. So it's been pretty nice. Let me just see. I think we got Ian on the line, so let's get him in. Hey, Ian, how are you?
Okay.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Hello, Ian.
What's the weather like
Hello,
where you
Rachel.
are? Ian?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Oh, I was just saying, what's the weather like where you are?
It's sunny, but extremely windy.
Yeah, that's us too. I was saying Rachel's got the rain now. She got our earlier weather.
Oh,
we had a massive
this morning,
thunderstorm.
yes.
Nice.
I was worried that we'd have a power cut because it was a big thunderstorm and it was right overhead where I live. And you could hear it rumbling, and it was just rumbling the windows and the frame. You felt it.
See, I love thunderstorms. I love thunderstorms. So for me, that's but it's a good backdrop for today's show, right? Dracula, Frankenstein, and some other sort of gothic horror creatures and creations and novels. And we're in the month of October now, so we're looking at bringing some sort of spooky horror related things in, just because hey, October is that month, right?
It's Halloween season.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we're doing next week, we're doing our live psychic reading show for the month of October. So that'll be really great. And I know that Ian won't be joining us for that one. But the week after, he will certainly be back with us. And we've got a couple of really cool shows coming up, and one that Ian, I'm sure, is excited for. Right, Ian?
I'll be doing my first ever virtual psychic fair and doing psychic readings for people. I'll have more information on that. There's going to be it's going to be a virtual psychic fair, so that's going to be quite exciting.
Hey, that's cool. Yeah, get that.
I can't wait to try it.
Yeah, and Ian picked Ian picked a number of shows for this month.
You did?
But we're going to be
great.
we're going to be doing Halloween, the movie, right? The first one. We're going to be talking about that.
Yeah, that's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
Because when I think of Halloween, obviously when you were a kid, you were thinking of dressing up in costumes and going to get candy. And now, as we're all older, and within the paranormal community, you think of perhaps the Celtic origins of Halloween. But for myself personally, when you say Halloween now, October 31st, I think of that Halloween movie.
That movie.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a fun show. That'll be a fun show, because I can honestly say that I've watched the film maybe once or twice at the most.
I'm not a big fan, but I haven't really had time to spend on it.
Yeah, and that's just it, right? But it's going to be fun because it'll be coming, Ian will be able to drive that show, and I'll be able to ask questions because it's been a while since I've seen it. So I think I'm going to watch it again before we do the show, just because. I think it's the best one out of the bunch of them is the first one, but that kind of goes with a lot of those sort of horror movies, right? As they get into number 6 and 7, and they've kind of run out of ideas, right? But I think that'll be a fun show. So today's show, the Gothic horror novels, the Dracula, the Frankenstein. Have you guys read those novels in their entirety ever?
I have, yes.
Bram Stoker's Dracula and I'm sorry, Ian.
That's okay.
Yes, Dracula and Frankenstein, yes, I have read both novels.
Yeah.
And have you read them too, Rachel?
Yes, I have. It was actually a mandatory reading as part of our English language class.
Nice.
That is, that's funny you say that, Rachel, because when I was in college, we had to take an English class. And that's exactly where I read them, was in this English college class. Yeah, it was part of the curriculum.
Right.
And
yes, it
was very cool reading those books. It really was.
Yes. It was interesting. It was a definite eye opener. And I think it initiated my love of that Gothic horror. And the whole genre. And I'm glad that I had the opportunity to be able to read it, even at that younger age, I had an appreciation for it. I'm glad I did. But I think maybe it's time to pull it back out off the shelf and reread it again.
They're great stories, right? And here's the thing: a lot of people don't realize about these books, right? Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula, is a lot of years between Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There's 80 years in the timeline of those books being written, because Mary Shelley wrote her book in 1818. And Bram Stoker didn't write his until 1897. So I find that really interesting that his novel is, still today one of the go-tos for, the real Dracula stories. And I think it's just the way it's done. But there's a real similarity between the two novels, and myself being a writer, and writing a lot of, these kinds of stories, these Gothic half Penny Dreadfuls and Penny Dreadfuls and things, these horror sort of, none of my stories are, they're all somewhat, involving either murder or death or some sort of thing. I can appreciate the style in which these are written. And I'm not sure if you guys remember, but both of these novels were written from an epistolary format, right? So they're both written from a format where the narrators are the novel's protagonists, right? So they're writing letters and they're writing back and forth, giving us, the reader, the narrative through these written accounts. And so both novels follow that. And that is something that I think there's probably some people still doing that today, but I find a lot of the stories now are written from a first-person account, right? That person is involved in the action or the situation. And so this is kind of an old way of writing this. And because in the Victorian era and in those times, they didn't have visuals, right? They didn't have television or radio even. So everything had to come from within one sort of, mind, but also too, letter writing was a very common thing in those days. So setting your stories out through this method of, creating it through letters or through accounts, written accounts, was really fairly easily digested by that, those people in that era, right? It would have been a very easy way for people to understand a story and to obviously give you an opportunity to come at it from a different perspective as well, because you're not actual protagonist in the story. You're sort of on the outside looking in, or you might be, and you're writing letters to others who are not. So I find it really interesting that both of these stories are written in that format. So that being said, which one do you guys want to tackle first? Do you want to
Can I just mention a different very quickly? I just really want to throw this in here.
Sure.
You mentioned we mentioned Dracula and Frankenstein, but it was brought to my attention when I was talking to my husband about doing the show today. He mentioned Carmilla, which is again around that same genre. It's an 1872 Gothic novella by an Irish author named Joseph Sheridan.
Joseph Sheridan. Yeah, well, La Fanu. I mean, The Ghost and the Bone Setter is one of the stories that by La Fanu that we do as a radio, play, and we also do it in our Christmas ghost storytelling quite frequently. And so, I mean, there's a lot of them. Dickens wrote series.
It's incredible,
of these
isn't it?
as well.
It's fantastic. We're still even talking. We're in 2020, and we're talking about these works that were created in 1872, which was 26 years predating Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yep, and actually, to predate all of them is Barney the Vampire.
Yes, Barney.
Yeah, and Barney the Vampire was a Penny Dreadful that was written. It was a serial story that was written, and I think that's where Stoker got a lot of his ideas from. I'm going to put it out there because
I think so too.
There's quite a number of similarities between Barney and Dracula.
Well, the thing that stood out to me is that with Carmilla, it's a female vampire named Carmilla.
That's right. Yeah.
And she was an Irish writer. And there was sort of this hints towards lesbianism and her being the first lesbian vampire, and this was in 1872 in Ireland. So,
and we think it's shocking. You know, we actually think that's shocking, but that was I don't want to say it was familiar, but people certainly weren't. I mean, people had to hide it a lot more back then, but with women it always seemed to be less reprehensible than the men. And so, I mean, you often had, the two old spinsters or the aunties or the, the sisters who, and I mean, it was really just a societal format for, women living together under the same roof, right? But with men, it never seemed, at that time, of course, that was completely taboo. But an interesting thing. But I mean, there's a number of these stories throughout that period, and I really think maybe we should start with Frankenstein because Mary Shelley, it was really sort of the progenitor of these kinds of stories. I did quite a bit of digging, and I mean, there's some kind of horror or Gothic, sort of feel to some earlier stories, even in the late 1700s, but nothing to the extent of what she came out with, nothing to that level of, being able to write a book that was, I'm going to ask you guys, like, how did you feel like when you read the story? Because for me, I felt really sorry for the monster in the story. Yeah. And there's so many situations today that we can still use that as a social commentary.
Oh my gosh. Oh.
Yeah, but I really felt very sorry for the creature in that. And like Ian, when you read it, how did you feel about it? Do you remember how you felt in terms of the creature and the story itself? And
to be honest, it's been so long since I read it because college was 35 years ago.
Yeah, well, I know that feeling.
But as you say, the story being told from a narrative perspective. Frankenstein is an interesting piece of writing because it's actually told from three different narrative perspectives.